Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 18 of our reading of Guinevere by Sharan Newman. As always, we're going to go over the copyright information, and I forgot to say something in the last episode, but we'll say it in this one. This book is copyright 1981 by Sharan Newman. I also have to say that this book is still for sale, where books are sold, as is the Chessboard Queen and Guinevere Evermore. So, if you want to check those out, check your local bookstore. Anyways, in the last episode, Guinevere was captured, and Gawain, Cador, Arthur, Leodegrance, and Merlin all came up with a plan, and something to do with a Trojan horse. That should be interesting. But now, and we also went back to Guinevere, and she was in the Saxon camp on some dusty furs. And we're going to continue from that. They were dragging somebody close to her, a slave. And we're going to pick this up, because I know this is interesting. Because I know what's going to happen. Ael was not interested in hearing the complaints of the slave. We brought you with us because you speak her language. Now go over there with us and translate. I will hear not a word more, and if I discover that you have said one word other than what I tell you, I'll have your tongue for my breakfast. Guinevere heard the shouting and angry words and shrank as far as she could into the furs. Ael was coming back now. Two other men were dragging the slave between them. She could see that his clothes were ragged and that the collar was his only ornament. Even though Guinevere had no imagination, she felt a nameless dread slip over her, and as she remembered half-heard stories about strange, horrible things Saxons did with women, captives, she felt her hands grow icy and her heart pound in her throat as the men brought their struggling burden nearer. The slave kept his face averted all the while so she could not see him. No matter how he fought, he didn't move his head. She could tell that the side towards her was hideously scarred, and feared that the side he was hiding might be even worse. Her stomach started to recoil when a slap made the slave turn and face her fully. For a second, Guinevere just stood there, unable to believe what she saw. Then she screamed over and over in choking gasp. She cried out. Finally, she managed to push forth one lone word. Mark. Mark, she sobbed and fell into his arms. Hush, Guinevere, hush. You mustn't let them know who I am. Try to control yourself, he begged. But she could not stop shaking and sobbing. What's wrong with her? Ael demanded. What does Mark mean? It means mercy, Mark replied angrily. You have terrified the poor girl. She recognized that I was one of her own people and wants me to plead with you to save her. Well, calm her down. Tell her that we won't do a thing to her if she stops that shrieking. What a noise. I thought she was bewitched, Ael complained. Go on, tell her. Mark detangled her arms from him. He smoothed her hair and wiped her eyes and nose with his shirt, and as he had when she was a child. Guinevere, it is all right. Never mind why I'm here. Just listen to me. This is Ael. He doesn't want to hurt you. He only plans to trade you for Alswitha. The Saxons are a strange people, but they have their own ideas of honor and will not harm you, I believe, unless they refuse to return his daughter. Do you understand? Alswitha? Guinevere questioned. Ael was watching her closely. He nodded empathetically. They know you are They know you are her friend. Ecgfrith told them all about his stay at Cador. Ecgfrith? We thought he had drowned. Mark frowned. I wish he had. It was his idea to capture you. Ael never would have thought of it. He is more of the type to storm the castle. But what can we do, Mark? Nothing. Just hope that Arthur agrees to release Alswitha. And when they do, Guinevere, you must promise you will never tell anyone that you saw me here. Do you understand? What? What are you talking about? That's enough, Ael thundered. Does she understand? Mark refused to face her again. She does, he answered. Then return to your work, Corel. I think that I pronounce it Coral, so I might be pronouncing it wrong. I apologize. And next time you receive an order, do not ignore it, or you will wish we had killed you with the rest of your army. Mark only gave him a mocking smile that was particularly horrible on his stricken face. In the following days, Guinevere grew less concerned about her own fate and more worried about Mark. It made no sense to her. She was alone in this strange place, and she wanted him now more than she ever had wanted anyone before. Finding him here was a miracle, and she supposed that he would be as overjoyed as she, but he shrank from her. When he wasn't being used as an interpreter, he kept as far from her as possible. She couldn't understand why. The scars on his face meant nothing to her. Was it something she had done? His rejection of her hurt her terribly. Each day they broke camp and started her walking again further to the east. She hated this. If only they had given her a horse. Her shoes were for riding and were not strong in the soles. But she had learned that if she lagged or stumbled, someone would pick her up and carry her. And this was even more offensive. So she marched on with set lips. She saw that Mark was not forced to stay in any one place, and yet he always managed to be as far from her as possible. Finally, she decided that he was completely indifferent to her, and for some reason liked living as a slave. This made her angry, and her anger carried her on for several miles. She had started calling her unicorn almost at once, but he had taken a long time to respond. Finally, she became aware of his intelligent concern for her, but his answer was very faint. "I am far from you," he told her, "but do not fear, I am coming for you." That satisfied her, and Guinevere ceased to worry that she might not be rescued. It would happen. That was enough to know. The only problem now was in reaching Mark, who was further away from her than a mythical creature could ever be. For Mark, these days were the worst of any since that murky afternoon of his last battle. He thought he had drawn. I think that should be drawn a boundary line carefully through his memory. His life before was neatly kept deep in some dark place where he need not look at it. Any thought of his home, his childhood, his family always brought him to that last moment, to the death screams of his brothers, to his last own insane rage and the searing pain across his face, and finally to the knowledge that he had lived. It was better to imagine that he had always been a slave, following the rounds of labor and subservience with the dull numbness of the hopeless. But there was Guinevere resting serenely upon her cushions, as unconsciously arrogant as only the pampered child of the wealthy could be. She showed no more fear of her captors. She didn't even seem to be interested in them. Mark had forgotten that calm, assured tilt to her chin, the air of being sublimely certain of her place at the top of the order of society. Had he ever been like that? Elswitha had always called him "my lord Coral." He had thought she mocked him, but that was another memory to subdue. Her cool hands reaching through the pain. She had never shown disgust at his looks. She had kept him alive for weeks when he longed for death. How he had hated her for that gift. Poor little Elswitha, so timid, so lonely. Blast and shrivel that Egfrith. What kind of man would leave her alone like that, among enemies? Mark's brain followed the treadmill of all he would forget. He wanted to ask about home and if his parents were well, but that would only start the cycle again. The only thing was to avoid Guinevere and hope she would respect his desire and keep silent about his fate. Ael and Ecgfrith had been watching Guinevere too. She would make a fine queen, Ecgfrith mused. She would be an ornament to any hall. Why should we return her to her people? What if we gave her a greater honor? We gave Vortigern one of our women to wed. It is time that we return the gesture. What better way to affirm our right to Britain than by forming an alliance with one of their great houses? I am glad you feel that way, my son. Ael smiled craftily. I have been thinking the same thing. I have been very lonely since your mother left, and things have not been managed well. Elswitha never had any authority in the hall. This one will do for me very well indeed. Ecgfrith glared at his father, who laughed in his face. Get your own bride, my son. This one is for me. Remember, I have many sister sons with the same right as you in my lands. Why would she marry a man whose landhold is uncertain? And what of Alswitha? You have said how much you care for her. She will not be returned unless we can bargain for her. You don't think You didn't think of that when you wanted this woman for yourself, but we can arrange something. Perhaps one of their lords will take her to wife. That will solve the matter." Ecgfrith swallowed his words and bowed from his father's presence, but he vowed that he would rather see Guinevere and Alswitha both killed than know that his father had taken his prize from him. Chapter 15. Guinevere was sharply awakened late one night by a strange noise in the woods. On the opposite side of the camp from her, her first impulse was to pull the furs over her head and go back to sleep. She had walked all day over scarcely visible paths and worn-out shoes, and was tired to the marrow of her bones. The guards around her were silent but alert, and were staring anxiously in the direction of the noise. She kept hearing people moving about the camp as the rustling in the trees grew louder. Finally, she forced herself to open her eyes and found out what was going on. The fires had died out. It was about an hour before dawn. The sky was that gray color between stars and sun, and it was more difficult to see in than dark night. The earth was smothered in fog. Guinevere could hear the guards muttering nervously. What was that noise? It sounded like a large animal pushing its way through the undergrowth. But there was also the noise of wood being snapped and gnashed, and perhaps metal being pounded. She peered into the darkness, but the fog shifted and spun so that she could make nothing out. The clanging and gnashing sounds were getting louder and closer. Trees swayed and branches crackled as the thing passed by. A red glow bobbed through the darkness, twice the height of a man. By now everyone was awake, standing gaping in awe or terror as the noise and the light came closer to the camp. Suddenly there was a tremendous roar, and a hideous monster came raging into the midst of the men. It was huge, as tall as a watchtower, and covered with fur and tough hide. Long strings of moss dangled from its shoulders, and several arms. Its single eye glared in crimson fury, and its cavernous mouth glinted with steel-sharp teeth. Blood dribbled down its chin. A constant cacophony of groans and whines came forth from its midsection, and as they watched frozen, it charged the nearest man and trampled him underfoot before the terrified Saxon could even draw his sword. A few soldiers made a feeble attempt to stand against the thing, but most of them ran screaming into the forest. Many returned in a gibbering streak of panic, pursued by a second beast that appeared from the opposite side, just to the left of Guinevere. She watched in bewilderment as her fierce captors fell in a babbling heap on the ground, or grabbed what they could and sped to the safety of the dark woods. Ael, Ecgfrith, and a few of their earls were making earls. I think that's supposed to be earls. Wait a minute. Ecgfrith and some of their earls were making an effort to fight the thing, when all at once a mass of horsemen, all wearing horns and with their faces painted scarlet and blue, forced their way into the clearing. At the sight of them, Ael understood how he had been tricked, and with a savage scream he attacked. One of the riders galloped to where Guinevere stood, too stunned to move. He swooped down and tried to to pull her into the saddle with him. She writhed furiously in his grasp, and at first she could not make out what he was yelling. "Guinevere, stop! We're here to save you. Please, you're pulling off my costume." Guinevere relaxed her kicking and looked up into the face of the man holding her. She saw a Roman nose and a strong chin, streaked with paint and dirt. "Who are you?" she shrieked over the tumult. "Arthur, your parents sent me to find you. Hurry, we mustn't give them time to reorganize." She swung up behind him and screamed in his ear, "We can't go without Mark. You have to find him." "Mark? My brother. He's here somewhere. We can't leave him." "Guinevere, Mark is dead. We saw him go down." "No, he's here, I tell you. Help me find him." She slid from the horse again, despite his attempts to catch her. Then she waded right through the jungle of riders and monsters and frantic Saxons, totally oblivious to the swords and hooves and the shouts of those she passed. Arthur yanked his horse around and tried to follow her. He hacked his way through the mess, hoping that he wouldn't hit any of his own men. He found Guinevere on the other side, tugging at a slave who was resisting her ferociously. "I told you to leave me alone," he cried. "I'm not going back. I won't let them see me like this. Guinevere, Get away from me. Arthur could never have recognized the battered face, but the voice was past mistaking. For a second, he could only sit in disbelief, tears blurring his eyes. He shook himself quickly. This was no time for questions. Lieutenant, he barked, you are coming with us. Take this horse and your sister and get out of here. That is an order. Mark squinted at him, and then his eyes widened as he recognized his commander and friend. Arthur, I can't, he began. You will, Arthur roared, and leaped to the ground. Guinevere, take my horse and get up behind him. Be sure he stays with us. Her safety is on you, Mark. One of the men was wounded and hanging from his horse. Arthur scooped him up and mounted behind the injured man. Guinevere caught at the bridle. Arthur threw her and pushed Mark until he was on the animal's back. Then she clambered up herself. The sky was growing lighter, and the monsters had wisely stomped back into the forest. A knot of horsemen were still fighting Ael and his companions. Seeing that Guinevere had been recovered, the horsemen tried to disengage themselves, but were having trouble getting away. Arthur drove his horse through the center, his wounded partner gripping the mane for dear life. Ael faltered and fell back onto his son, his shoulder gashed and spurting blood. Icfrith saw that the Britons were getting away and tried to throw Ael off, but he was too late. In another moment, the remnant of the rescue party was gone, Arthur at their heels. There was nothing more to be done. Arthur had won again. Icfrith surveyed the destruction caused by the monsters and the Britons. He rained all the curses of the goddess Hel upon the cowards who had run. Some of them would never know a roof over their heads again. If he had his way. Outcasts from their clan, they would be for this, and he would be sure that they wandered unaided by any lord until they died. But even that revenge could not console him for this outrage. With smoldering hatred, he returned to the side of his father. Perhaps the old man would die, and then the land right would be his. The thought was grimly cheering. As Guinevere rode through the growing dawn, her arms wrapped tightly around her brother, she thought she heard laughter. She looked all around, and in her astonishment for the source, no one near her appeared in the mood for levity. The men around her were exhausted, each painted face bowed over his horse's mane as they tried to stay awake. The monsters, towers of wood overlaid with leather, fur, and branches had been cast off and left to rot. Among the trees, the men who had carried them, perched dangerously on platforms over their saddles, were making no pretense of staying alert. They were slumped on the horses' necks, swaying a little as they passed from sleep to drowse and back again. Their animals looked as tired as the men, for they had been ridden hard since the previous morning to reach her before it was too late. The tired beasts kept moving from habit and in the hope, no doubt, that somewhere soon there would be some soft grass and clover. So who was laughing? There was such delight in the sound that Guinevere smiled too in anticipation of the joke. Then she became aware that no one else had heard the merriment. The sound was in her mind alone. She sent out a question. Yes, the unicorn answered. I was here all night, but you didn't need me. I had never seen such amazing creatures. It was really astonishing the way they put those monsters together. Some of those men who captured you ran directly into me in the fight. They cried out in horror and flew in the other direction. I was somewhat offended. I have always gathered from you that I was a rather handsome beast. Of course you are, Guinevere soothed. But why? But what did you find so amusing? Humanity, he replied, and she could get no more explanation than that. I must return to the shore, he committed. I will wait for you there. You should come soon, I think. I have a strange feeling that someone needs you there. Then he was gone. Mark sat stiffly behind her, his head and face hidden in a cloak someone had tossed him. She leaned her cheek against his back and tried to feel a softening in him, a response to her concern, but his spine remained straight, and he showed no interest in her. He was lost in his own anger and fear. Arthur watched him and worried. He thought he knew what Mark was feeling. How could he face his parents after allowing his brothers to die and himself to be so degraded by his captors? Arthur could sense the pride and the shame, even though he couldn't completely agree with it. He hoped Mark would change when he had been home for a time. Perhaps he would fit back into his old life when he realized that no one would blame him for what had happened, that they would only rejoice that he was alive, and Arthur considered a little guiltily, I need him. I must have a man like that in my government, one who knows both worlds and can bring them together. But Arthur had no idea how to convince this sullen stranger of that. He fervently hoped that Leodegrance would know what to do. He had pushed all his men well beyond their strength, but finally it was clear that they would have to rest, himself included, so he signaled a stop. Most of the men were so tired that they simply fell to the ground, dragging their saddles and blankets with them, and trusted that their horses would be nearby when they awoke. No one suggested setting a watch. Arthur wanted more than anything to be able to join them, but being the commander had its curses. He carefully tethered his horse and then strolled over to where Mark and Guinevere were settled themselves. Guinevere still had one arm around her brother and was speaking to him in a low, urgent tone. As he approached, she gave Arthur a pleading look, and that stopped him in his tracks. This was the first time that he had really had time to see his face. "Oh, Holy Mother," he thought, "what kind of despair! She is more exquisite than anyone told me." The distance between them seemed to lengthen, and he wondered if he possibly had the energy to finish walking to where she sat. Guinevere tried to give him a grateful smile. She was very glad that he had saved her and was respectful of the authority he had shown when he made Mark accompany them. Even now, covered with grime, he appeared impressive. She watched him come towards them, unaware that her gaze made it difficult for him to move. He was the biggest man she had ever seen, next to Timon, and while Timon had been a part of the forest he lived in, brown and sturdy as an oak, Arthur was different, like some force which had come to tame the wild things, yet is still half wild itself. His short hair was a rich auburn, and his fine chin, normally clean-shaven, was now shaded by a stubble oddly darker than his hair. Although he felt clumsy and foolish to her, he appeared powerful, imposing, strangely exciting. Guinevere decided she liked him. There was something about him that reminded her of Gawain, only fiercer. Arthur was amazed to find that it was still daylight when he reached them. He knew he had been walking those few steps for hours. Mark sat with his head buried in his bent knees, determined not to notice either one of them. Guinevere put her hand out to Arthur with a glance that made his head spin, so that he didn't catch what she was saying. "And I don't know what else to tell him, to convince him," she concluded, as Arthur tried to focus on the conversation. Who was she talking about? Oh, yeah, Mark. He sighed. He was more tired than he realized. What could he say to Mark? If only Mark would say something for himself. He bent and touched Mark's shoulder. There was a shrug as if to throw him off, but it was checked. Arthur thought it was a good sign. He wished that he had Merlin's talent with words. "Mark, you must listen," he began roughly, surprised at the choke in his own voice. "I don't know what they did to you. I don't know why you won't greet your sister or your old friends. We could not have rescued you sooner. We thought you were dead. You have a right to be bitter, spending 3 years and more in captivity like that. Please forgive me for not finding you before." That set Mark off. He sat up at once, his good eye blinking away tears. "Forgive you?" he rasped. "Arthur, you always were an idiot off the field. I allowed myself to be captured. I made no attempt to escape, to send word that I still lived. I wanted to see no more of anyone. Do you understand? I'm sick of it all. I don't want to go back. If I can't be dead to myself, at least let me be so to the rest of the world. Look at my face. I'm half a corpse already. Mark, your scars were honorably earned. In battle, you have no cause to be ashamed of them. Listen to me, please. You needn't fight again. You needn't go near a battlefield. You are more important to me than that. So much has happened. I must have someone to help me build my city, someone who can read, who knows the old ways, and who can call back the exiles. It is not enough to push back the invaders. We must create a new society for those who have survived. I don't have to be it doesn't have to be Rome again. It can be better, a city of God and a city of man combined. I have such plans and such dreams, but I need you to help. Mark looked at him with a kind of wonder. His answer was softer than before, but no less firm. You will build a new order if anyone can, but not with me. It is too late for me. I have gone far beyond caring about what happens to the world. The stench of the dying, the dead, the rotting clings to me. I can't look at anything now without wondering how long it has before it joins the refuse pile, and almost wishing that the time would come soon. I can no longer even desire the delights of heaven, but only to lay my body in the earth and shrivel into oblivion. Guinevere shrank from him. She could not see the ravaged profile. She could only see the ravaged profile of his face and his words. His voice were not of the brother she had loved. She wondered vaguely if she had been tricked by some roving demon into releasing him into the world. Arthur regarded his friend with pity. You sound like the mad Irish saints howling that we live in the world filled with sin and decay, but they at least look forward to the purity of the next life. I have seen and smelled the same foulness as you have. I have wept over the bodies of men I sent to their doom, but it has only determined me to try, at least to try, and make something better. What good are you to the world like that? What will anyone gain by your death? Mark spoke slowly and with bitter defiance. What do I care? Arthur sank back on his heels, defeated. His friend Mark was gone. He could not communicate with this man. All his pleasure in the accomplishment of a successful mission evaporated. Guinevere laid her hand on his shoulder. It's not your fault. You tried. He's not Mark anymore. I don't know him. If we could only get him home. No, Mark dropped the word into the abyss between them. I will not go back. I do not wish to see them. You have Guinevere safe. Leave me behind. Ride with us for one more day, Mark, Arthur begged, just until tomorrow night. Then you may go where you wish. I will even give you a horse. Even as he said it, he realized how foolish it was. Why would tomorrow make him feel any different? I don't care, Mark answered. If you insist, now let me be. His head returned to his knees. Guinevere and Arthur rose. She was tall, only a few inches less than he, but so finely built that he felt like an oaf beside her. She moved away from her brother with casual grace, and he struggled to stay next to her without tripping on roots or the hem of her robe. My Lord Arthur, she was saying, I thank you very much for trying to help Mark and for coming to my aid. It was very kind and courageous of you to take so much trouble for me. He wanted to tell her that a trifling few days of his life, the danger of death, a lost night's sleep were hardly worth her gratitude, and he would cheerfully have stormed the walls of Constantinople for the honor of having her beside him. But he could only stare at her like a homeless puppy begging for notice. She was puzzled and did not reply. She was puzzled that he did not reply. Then it occurred to her that he was probably had no rest at all in the last 2 nights. How rude of her to stand like that, making conversation with a man when all he wanted was a few hours' sleep. We're going to stop that there. We've been reading from Guinevere. This is a book by Sharan Newman. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe. Ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also want to say this book is still for sale. And along with the Chessboard Queen and Guinevere Evermore, the trilogy, in other words. Anyways, if you want to support me in any way, all that information is in the description below. And thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.